From the American Neurological Association, I'm Adeline Goss. This is ANA Investigates. Today on the show, we'll be talking with Dr. Walter Koroshetz about the 75th anniversary of NINDS, the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. Dr. Koroshetz serves as director of NINDS. He joined the institute in 2007 as deputy director and became director in 2015. Before joining NINDS, Dr. Koroshetz served as Vice Chair of Neurology, Director of Stroke and Neurointensive Care Services at Massachusetts General Hospital, and neurologist in the MGH Huntington's Disease Clinic. We'll talk about some highlights of the Institute's past and what lies ahead in the future. Welcome, Dr. Koroshetz.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goss. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, so let's start with a sweeping view of the past. Let's look back over the 75-year history of NINDS. What do you see as some of the Institute's most transformative contributions to neurological science?
Well, I guess the thing to mention when you talk about NINDS, define who NINDS is. People think of it as a government agency in DC, but that's not really true. We're basically a community. We're the funders of other people's work primarily. We do have an intramural program where we have science going on, but 90% of our money goes out to universities and biotech companies around the country. So NINDS is an ecosystem, multiple stakeholders, including the people we fund, but also, the nonprofit organizations that represent people with neurological diseases. And so the successes that we've seen in neurology are really testimony to this big collaboration that we're part of. So if you look backwards, 75 years, that's 1950, and we really didn't know much back in those days about, how the brain works or about, what causes neurological diseases, and certainly we didn't have many treatments. So if you think about neurology today compared to neurology in 1950, it's a completely different ballgame. There was clearly big advances. Stroke risk has decreased about 70% since 1950. And if you just think about that you're talking about millions of people who don't get a stroke now due to these preventative measures. Multiple sclerosis treatments, I came out of training in 1981, and, there were a couple of drugs, Cytoxan, steroids, but, things have really changed. The ability now to prevent exacerbations is really quite striking. I think about epilepsy. I think we had phenobarb and dilantin and tegretol, and now there's many different agents. So yeah, I think neurology has moved from a kind of diagnosis adios type of practice to a real treatment-focused practice. I mean, you have to kind of pat yourself on the back a little bit, but not too much because still so many people that we don't help. And so I think we're just starting to make the kind of impact that is going to happen in the next 75 years.
NINDS has really helped to drive forward this field-wide dramatic change over the last decades. And, I also imagine that there have been roles that NINDS has played in driving innovation across disciplines, for example, in neuroimaging or neuromodulation, basic neuroscience. Can you speak to some of those?
Sure. In terms of, some of the examples you mentioned, neuromodulation, I like that one as an example because the story is that there was a young neurologist named Malin DeLong who came to NIH. There was a lab here, the EVARTS lab, which was doing, trying to figure out how the brain worked by putting electrodes into the brain of non-human primates and having them, do certain tasks. And hard to imagine anybody could make any progress going one neuron at a time. But anyway, Malin came in, and the story is he wanted to study the motor cortex, but Evart said, no, you have too many people doing that. You should study the basal ganglia. I think Malin was not that happy, but he didn't really have a choice. And so he started working in the basal ganglia, and he figured out these circuits in the basal ganglia, and that led to how deep brain stimulation can help people with Parkinson's disease. So the take-home point there is that oftentimes, these big advances, it's like one person is kind of the trigger and it starts a field off, and then you see benefits. Unfortunately, the benefit is oftentimes 20 years after the trigger. Imaging, I was definitely in the imaging field for a long time in the beginning, and it was just fascinating what these new tools can do. So the question was in a stroke patient, how would you know if the stroke is done or whether it's going to grow? And if it's growing, if you take the clot out, well, it can prevent the growth. And those are all kind of hypotheticals, but then we got this diffusion weighted perfusion imaging at Mass General, and that led to diffusion imaging for acute stroke. But then the other interesting story there is that we had someone who was doing CT research and said, well, would it be any good if we could figure this out with a CT scanner instead of an MR? I said, oh my gosh, that would be just amazing. And then sure enough, we worked out algorithms where you could get very similar data from a CT scan. And and in doing so, we could actually see, on we gave the dye, and you could see where the clot is. And that's what got us into the intraarterial business, taking clots out. In the beginning, we were doing that with really dangerous drugs, urokinase, instill into the clot to dissolve it. And there were some miracles, absolutely miracles, but the new technologies are so much better. So it takes time. People have to realize, think into the future about, how they can move research to actually get to a major clinical breakthrough and just keep working at it. And also getting lots of other people involved is really important. You can't go from a discovery in your lab to a therapy by keeping it in your lab.
I wonder if you could also give some examples of NINDS funded research that, has had really broad public health impact beyond the field of neurology.
Well, that's a good question. I guess the one that comes to mind is the SPRINT trial, which we funded with multiple other institutes, looking at aggressive blood pressure lowering versus kind of standard 140 over 80 blood pressure management in people with vascular risk factors who are, elderly. We got into it because we wanted to see the effect on cognition, and the study had to get stopped. It was supposed to go for 5 years. They had to get stopped at 3 years. And the reason was because there was a big mortality difference. The people with aggressive blood pressure lowering were living, and the people without it, they had a higher mortality rate. Initially, we were really happy that the trial showed improved mortality from aggressive blood pressure lowering, but we were a little disappointed because we thought, well, we're never going to find out what's going to happen to cognition because the trial had to get stopped so early. We figured that we put so much money into it, we might as well just check and see. And amazingly, it showed improvement in cognition separate from mortality. I think it's just an example that the brain is not just sitting there in a tub, it's part of the rest of the body. So I think the big question now is how do we generalize these results and implement them across the country? Sadly, blood pressure is well known to be a silent killer, and still 47% of people with high blood pressure are uncontrolled, and there's thousands of people who don't even know they have high blood pressure. So the new administration, they're interested in making America healthy again, and I'm just pushing, let's lower the blood pressure. You'll see great benefit very quickly in terms of mortality, heart disease, stroke, and also you'll prevent dementia. So what could be better than that?
We've been talking about a number of these diseases that are common: stroke, dementia, Parkinson's. Can we also just talk about conditions that are historically under-recognized or underfunded? How has NINDS contributed to improving outcomes or quality of life for those types of neurological conditions?
Well, we could maybe talk about two general buckets there. If you look at data on conditions that cause disability and how much money they get, the one that always ranks at the bottom is headache. So headache research at NIH has not really been where you'd like it to be in terms of you look at the money, but it's a major cause of disability in the US. And I remember Susan Amaro, who's the scientific director of mental health, actually discovered CGRP, and that was maybe 40 years ago. But now it's a treatment. So NIH funded research. We study, if you look at our budget, about 22% of our money goes to neuroscience that's not tied to any disease at all. So our big impact is usually in the basic side of things. And particularly in the headache field, you can see how industry took the basics and developed some more effective therapies for migraine. But if you look at the actual research in migraine, it's not as robust as we would like, but it's still a big problem. The other bucket, I think, is what is the rare diseases. Some people say we have 300 rare diseases in NINDS, so that presents a problem. If you want to go after every single one separately, it's not going to work. So we have to be clever enough to figure out what kind of platforms we can develop that will then take down a whole bunch of different rare diseases. And I'm actually pretty excited about that because of the genomic therapies that are coming out. At NINDS, we've gravitated towards trying to blaze a path forward for neurogenetic diseases with genomic therapies. Certainly, it's been fueled by the success with spinal muscular atrophy, where you had kids who were going to die before they're 1 year old, and now they get a gene therapy and it's doing really well. So if you can do that for spinal muscular atrophy, why can't you do that for every one of these diseases? We set up a program called Urgent to develop treatments for neurogenic diseases. There's some advantages in genomic therapy compared to small molecules in that it shouldn't take as long. There's no IP on the sequence. You can make an antisense in your lab. You can make a gene therapy in your lab. You're not beholden to the drug companies to do a lot of medicinal chemistry stuff. But we're still early in those days. It's definitely dangerous. But I think there's going to be just one success after another in these rare diseases, and then I think people will use these technologies for the more common diseases too. Yeah.
So let's keep talking about the future. As national funding priorities are evolving, how is NINDS adapting to ensure continued progress in some of these key areas of neurological research?
Right. So that's a good question. There are different IC directors and they have different philosophies about how to go about that. So my philosophy is that if you have somebody in the government trying to tell people what kind of science to do, it's not going to turn out well. So I think the beauty of NIH and certainly NINDS is that it's very much run on the idea that you track really smart people who want to solve really important problems, and then you basically fund them and let them go and see what happens. So what we do though is we look for gaps, and then we kind of sprinkle funds in the gap to try and create research in that space. And then sometimes we are able to convince the Congress that some of these gaps are worth filling with not just a sprinkle, but a lot of funding. And that's what happened in the Brain Initiative, for instance. So if you think about neurology, we see patients, we examine them, we get a history, we understand neuroanatomy, and we say, well, these symptoms are coming from here, and this is the pattern, so it must be this disease. And we know about pathology, so we know in the brain what we'd expect the pathology is. And that's how neurology has worked for forever. The problem is that what the patient is experiencing is really dependent on the dysfunction of the circuits that subserve those properties. So if you think about it, a stroke doctor, If you see lacunes, you have somebody with a pure motor hemiparesis, you see a lacune, you say, oh, that's a pure motor hemiparesis. You see other lacunes in the brain, and you can't predict what they caused. And so you work backwards and you're 100%. But if you see a lacune and then have to tell the tell somebody what the symptoms are, you're going to be very inaccurate because you don't know what the circuit was that it's affecting. So the circuits have been the black box. So the brain initiative was to develop the tools to analyze these circuits and analyze the circuits to basically form the map of the neuroanatomy of circuits, and then to be able to monitor the circuits in action. We talked about Malin DeLong looking at, one cell at a time. With these tools, you can see 1 million cells at a time in a behaving mouse. And what you realize is it's not really one little area like we think about as neurologists. The whole brain is involved when you do almost any task. And the brain has these, it's a massive computer that's taking in information, it's processing it, and it's doing something with the information. But we don't have a clue what the rules are in that space. And that, for us to figure that out now, it used to be, in Malin's time, you couldn't get the data. Now the problem is we can get the data, but how do you figure out from 1 million neurons what is going on? But that's the answer. It's there. It's just the computational mystery to try and get at the bottom of the process. And so the Brain Initiative, which is something that Congress has really got behind with serious funding, just completely revolutionized this area. And those tools, which are now so powerful in the mouse, are over time going to come to the human. And that's going to really change things.
As we're talking about appealing to Congress for funding in some of these key areas, how do you think about the strategies for communicating the societal value of neuroscience research to policymakers and also to the public?
Yeah, really good question. And I don't think we'd be doing that good a job at it. So I'm happy to talk about it. The thing to say right off the bat is that I didn't realize this when I came to NIH, but it's illegal for me to reach out to Congress. I had a friend who worked for a senator, and so I called him once, and I got a slap on my hand. You can't call somebody who's working for a senator. So, but we're always on call. If they call us, we just show up immediately, chop down everything, just go and talk to them, because it's so important for them to understand the value of what we're doing. And it's not, for neurologists like ourselves, we assume, oh, everybody understands this. They realize how important it is. Not true. You really have to tell people, explain to people what you're doing. And the good news is that almost everybody is interested in the brain, and not just their brain, but their parents' brain, their kids' brains. And so there's something that really draws people so that if you can kind of get on their wavelength, there's a lot of interest out there. So I think that's what neurologists should be doing. That's what patient organizations should be doing. The government is not good at that, but it's these stories that are real that grab people. And I think we have to do better as neurologists in talking to the people next door when you're mowing the lawn or you go into the store at the checkout counter, you wear a little pin with a brain. They always, oh, what's that? Oh, well, let me tell you about that. So there's a lot more we can do, but you can't rely on the government to do this. It really has to be grassroots, constant.
How do you see the role of NINDS in maintaining the United States leadership in neuroscience discovery over the next decade?
Yeah, good question. So the first thing to say is that science is collaborative. It really shouldn't have borders. The more compact you get, the slower you're going to be at moving the field forward. And so that's how it should be. Now, on the other hand, science is competitive, no question about it. Everybody's trying to get to the breakthrough first. And as being an American, I want to win that one. I want to win that one. So And I'm happy, that the Chinese want to win too, and the Europe and the French and the English. That's great. It's kind of like you go into a game, to a track meet, and everybody wants to win, and that's the way it should be. But I want to win. I don't want them to win. I want to win. So you got to try hard. It's good for science if it's competitive, the people trying to win. And I think it's important for the country. In neuroscience right now, we are in, I think, an elite position. But if we kind of slow down for 5 years, we're going to be surpassed by China, no question about it. And then there are advantages to the economy. There are advantages to our patients if we're, in the premier space. But on the other hand, if you get a treatment that, cures glioma, GBM, I don't care where it comes from.
And can I ask, you mentioned making America healthy again and the role of blood pressure lowering in that effort. Are there other key priorities that you're really making an effort to communicate right now across the government?
Sure. I mean, I would say that there's so many different answers to that question depending on what the interest of the person, of the group is. I mean, the other program we have that Congress has appropriated funds for is called the HEAL Initiative, Helping to End Addiction Long Term. And NINDS is the lead for developing non-addictive, better ways of managing pain. I think in neurology, we kind of didn't do well in terms of pain management. We kind of gave it up to some extent, and I think that's bad. It's basically a neurologic problem, chronic pain. And pain management in this country, I think, is not good. So that's one area where we'd like to make a difference, is to improve pain management. And I wish we could get more neurologists interested.
We've talked about so much here, and I've really appreciated your stories about early career investigators of past and present. What advice would you give, not just to someone early in their career, but really to any neuroscience investigator today?
Well, so I used to run the training programs at Mass General in neurology. And so just a couple of things to throw out there. I would advise people to understand what they're really interested in, and then to try to make an educated guess at what skill they could get that is their field doesn't have now. But if you could get that skill and bring it back in, it's going to really help the field. So that's what I would say is look around the edges. The biggest breakthroughs come from the convergence of fields. So the edges between neuro and immunology, or for me, it was stroke and MRI scanning. The tools also, I think, are important to think about. I tell people that you're no smarter than the older folks, but you'll be able to get better tools than them, and then you'll be able to answer questions that they could answer. And then, so if you can go and develop a technique that's not currently available in your field, which could be important, and bring it back in, then that'll really be a big advance. So that's kind of the general advice I would give to people. The other advice to give to people is what you want to do is understand what you really want to do with your career, not be pegged to one thing, because if it's one thing, your chances of getting there are slim. But if you have five things, they're all in the same bucket, you don't really care which one, then you're more likely going to be success. In my life, I would have a plan A, and plan A oftentimes just didn't work, but plan B turned out to be pretty good. So, so always not get all disappointed if you don't get your first choice in something. Just keep your eye on the big goal you're trying to get after, and there's many ways to get there.
This is great advice, and I just wonder if any of the way that you would counsel a neuroscientific or neurological investigator has changed in the last year, or has your advice basically remained the same and consistent regardless of how the funding environment is changing?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is that people are complaining way too much. The system we have is very competitive, so you're not always going to win and get your grant. But if you keep pulling away, then usually you're going to be fine, particularly in our field, because there's so many low hanging fruit. There's so many interesting areas. So as long as you don't give up, you'll be fine. And then there's so much out there that's interesting that you can have a really fulfilling life in neurology. So I tell people, just play the long game. Don't get all upset about what you read in the papers every day. The problems aren't going away. So, we have people kind of want to solve these problems. So I think in the long run, we're fine. And we just have to not get to the point where we give up in the short term. Just keep your eye on the prize, and it's going to work out.
Well, Dr. Koroshetz, what an expansive and uplifting conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with us and for sharing your thoughts.
Great pleasure, Dr. Goss. You guys have a great day.
That was Dr. Walter Koroshetz, Director of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. ANA Investigates is the official podcast of the American Neurological Association. The show's producers are members of the ANA Education Innovation Committee, chaired by Michelle Johansson. I'm Adeline Goss, podcast host and executive producer. Our production team this month included Michelle Johansson and Jen Hurley. You can listen to past episodes of the show, subscribe to us so you never miss an episode, and access all of the ANA's educational programs on the Education tab at myana.org. That's it for ANA Investigates. See you next month.